give yourself permission to start over every day, even break it down further, every moment if you have to. And when you start to frame it in this way, I think something pretty cool happens. We start to view starting over not as like this big fearful thing, but almost as an experiment, as something liberating. It frees us to try something differently. And here's the cool part. There is literally no limit to the number of times that we can fall down or fall off and then get back up. We can do this 100 times a day. It doesn't matter. In fact, I would argue that the more times we do start over, it's like doing another repetition of an exercise and we get better at it and it becomes more fun.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Starting Over with Shannon. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you. Honestly, I immediately connected with your story. I think it perfectly encapsulates the messages that we share on this podcast. And you have a great business and everything to back it all up. So I think I am excited. And I think the people listening too will be very eager to hear your words of wisdom. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I want to go straight to this time in your life where you were surfing in Senegal in 2008, competing in a surfing competition, I believe, and you had this experience of your legs going numb. Is that right? What happened that day?
Yep. So I had been traveling for probably 36 hours or so. Every winter around this time of year, I used to take these surf trips and travel and sometimes compete. And on this particular occasion, I was already feeling a little bit run down, but as a relatively healthy 20 something, didn't pay much attention to it, figured I'd sleep on the other end. But got there, and the morning that I arrived at like 6 in the morning, a friend of mine had registered me for a competition, local competition. Um, so eagerly, got out there to prove myself in the new lineup. And as you mentioned, on I think it was my second wave or something, my legs just completely gave out and my body went limp in the water. And I found myself just sort of in a bit of a concerning situation.
Was this at the moment that you were actually on your board on the wave?
Yeah, exactly.
So, what did that look like? Was that just a collapse smack onto the board or in the water or
I think it looked like doing somewhat of a somersault over the front of my board and just landing in the water, sort of adrift. And wipeouts happen, but this was different. This was not a regular stumble. This was as if my brain or nervous system or something had just said, "Okay, cut power," and I was just out.
you were conscious?
I was conscious, but I wasn't able to move. I was able to just sort of barely keep afloat. And then slowly, after a few minutes, a little bit of light started to come back on in my system, just enough for me to get onto my board. And then, after waiting a few minutes and catching my breath, starting to sort of crawl my way to shore. And pretty much from that point forward, it just felt like I was moving through absolute jello. Every movement, although I could actually move and do a movement like paddle, which requires some energy, it felt like it was requiring 100 times the amount of energy that it normally would.
Wow. And what happened next?
So next was a bit of a whirlwind. I actually ended up staying on that trip, going into bed for a few days, recouping, regaining a little bit of energy and bandwidth, but not really quite, well, not really even remotely finding my full feet back under me. After a couple of weeks, when I returned home as planned, I thought, okay, now I'm going to take it easy. I'll rest up, and then I'll get back into training. A few weeks turned into a few months. The symptoms got worse and seemed to progress from this peripheral or more physical exhaustion and fatigue and even muscle pain and tingling. It started to get closer into my insides and into my brain, into my cognition, to the point where that jello feeling I described of trying to move my body through jello, it felt like I was trying to think through jello. What I would later come to realize was really thick brain fog. But it became so thick that, as I described in the TED talk that I gave several years ago, there literally became a point in time where I was looking at these fuzzy spots on the floor. And as they came into focus and I realized that they were my shoes, I then realized that my brain didn't even have a connection for what they were for. It was just like these things. I know I've seen these things before. I think they have something to do with feet, but it was like that's to what degree my brain was just disconnected from what seemed like any rational thought process.
I legitimately didn't even know that brain fog was a thing. That doesn't mean you're just a bit, off today, you know?
Mm.
When you use it to go like, "Oh, I'm just a bit foggy, I'm just not very clear," but, that's a whole new level. Were you in Senegal also at the time? Still?
Yeah, so this was actually after I got back home, is when the real brain fog set in. I was in Senegal for several weeks with those physical symptoms, the muscle pain, the aches, and kind of like a flu. It just felt like flu-like symptoms with severe exhaustion. But the longer it went on after returning home is when it started to become more, physical and then more neurological.
Yeah. What ended up happening in the sense of, were you diagnosed with something? Did it feel like what happened to your life at that point?
Yeah. So, at the time, it because I didn't know what I was in for, and spoiler alert, I spent the next 3 years, 3.5 years in bed, bedbound with a catheter inserted in my heart and tethered to an oxygen tank. Um, but in that
Wow.
moment that I described, and when I returned home, I had no idea that that was coming. So my mind was still planning, right? I was still okay, a little bit more rest than I expected. This sucks, but that's what it is. I'll bounce back and get back to it. And when those weeks turn into months, eventually turning into years, that's when the inner story starts to change. And maybe that's something we can get into a little bit of how that shapes or in some way
Yes.
even requires us to let go of identity.
Right? Because I'm just like sitting with that seemingly blasé statement of I was in bed for 3 years. Like, do you literally mean that you were in a hospital bed for that duration of time?
Well, I was at home. So let me
You're
back
at
it up.
home.
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
back it up a moment here. So when the weeks turned into months, at this point, I decided, okay, it's it's best to go get this checked out. This is beyond just a flu. Um, and I started down this road of getting a lot of different diagnostics and tests. And at first, some doctors confirmed that it was just seemed like a bad cold or flu based on the symptoms. They ran some blood tests. They found that I had positive antibodies for Lyme disease, but to be honest, they didn't really think much of it because the standard thinking, especially at the time, this was a little bit over 10 years ago, was that Lyme disease, happens, you take a course of antibiotics to treat it, and after 3 weeks, it doesn't really can't really persist beyond that. We now know that that's not the case. It can certainly, persist, and symptoms can uh, persist for a long time after that. Um, but it was sort of like that was like one of many, many things that they found. None of them seemed to be real cause for concern to the doctors. And this is what was such cause concern for me, the patient, is that how what was coming back on paper on these test results really in no way mirrored how I felt, the symptoms, and so this is where it gets to be this unfortunately common experience that a lot of people have, whether it's chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic Lyme disease or any sort of ongoing symptomology that doesn't have a clear explanation, is the doctors don't have necessarily the right tools or methods of detection. So they're not able to really see how you feel and what's going on. And then sometimes they'll say things like, well, maybe it's in your head, or maybe you should see a psychiatrist. And that was certainly the case for me. But of course, it's so far beyond in your head. It's very much in your body. It's very much, as I've come to understand, it's not psychological, it's actually neurological.
Yeah, and can I just say like that, I mean, I've not experienced this personally, but I know that my mum has also been in a situation. She recently got diagnosed with Lyme disease as well, and had an earlier stint in a hospital, probably during the period this was undiagnosed, had the very experience that you just described of it's all in your head. And I remember her reaction to that of being so unheard, so invalidated, and that is so painful as an experience for us as humans when we are all united in our desire to be seen and heard and understood and accepted. So, did you live it in that way too, or was there a part where you thought, okay, you're not seeing it, and you could deflect it back to the doctor who didn't,
Yeah, I would say it was more on the first side, and that's,
Mm,
I think, a phase of a condition, or a phase of a traumatic experience, or something that we go through, is the first, reflexive response once you get to that place of overwhelm and worry, is, if it's not easily solvable, is anger, frustration, rage. And where do you direct that? At the people who are telling you that you don't feel the way you feel, or that you're healthy when you're actually incredibly unwell. And you know yourself. No one knows you better, and that's what's so challenging. It's really hard to describe these types of conditions. And as I mentioned, going back to the very first step of, like, when I was in the water, the kind of weird things about conditions like Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome is that if you really mount a Herculean effort, sometimes you can make yourself appear normal for, like, a short period of time. And oftentimes, even just getting up and getting out and, like, going to a doctor will be that effort, and that's what they'll see, and they're like, well, you made it here, so you must not be that sick. Unbeknownst to them, now you have to go home and spend the next 6 weeks in bed recovering from that 1 hour outing, right? So this is very common, and very frustrating.
yeah, I can imagine a lot of people probably feel a lot of hope actually and understanding through you and the work that you do actually. So big praise to you for being that voice for so many people who feel voiceless in ways. And often I would assume feel a lot of self-doubt because in that experience of, this could be in your head, uh, I imagine people might go, could may maybe it is, maybe part of it is. No, surely not. I mean, oh, does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's weird because, I mean, in your core that it's not, because it's just your perception is so far out of whack. But I think where it gets really challenging, I know it was challenging for me, is um in some way it's in our head, meaning, like, our brain is a mediator here, and the brain is in the head. So the brain plays a huge role in. Here's a good example. Let's say, for instance, that uh, you pull two all-nighters in a row, right? You stay up for, I don't know, 72 hours straight. And then you go into the gym and you try and do the workout that you normally do, that you're used to doing, that you could easily do regularly. But now you find that you can't even lift half the weight, or you can't even exert half the force that you could just a few days ago. If a doctor looked at you and did scans and did muscle biopsies and all these things, he would say, well, you're fine, right? Because functionally, it's not that your body has all of a sudden overnight lost all of this muscle mass and lost all of this strength, but something has changed. And what's changed is your brain's ability to recruit muscle fibers and to activate that strength, to access it. And so, whenever someone's dealing with this kind of a condition, and this kind of applies to things like anxiety and depression as well, which are in the body, but they're also very much mediated by the brain, is that dramatic things that you just don't feel like yourself. And you know that. But from the outside, you know, no one could know it just by looking at you. And that's what makes these types of conditions, whether it's anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, or any, post-infectious type of syndrome where someone stays sick for so long, what makes them so malicious in a sense is that they are invisible ailments. And people say, well, you look fine, you seem fine. You know that you are far from it.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. So, just to backtrack a little for those who aren't sure, what is Lyme disease?
Yeah. So Lyme disease is essentially a bacterial infection, most commonly transmitted by a tick bite. In this day and age, it's used as kind of an umbrella term to include a lot of different co-infections. But even beyond that, it's a whole syndrome that can take place. And just to note, there's still a lot of controversy on chronic Lyme. I just saw an article in Nat Geo last week that came out talking about some of these controversial issues. Because, as I mentioned, by conventional medicine standards, bacterial infection, such as a spirochetal infection, which is the Lyme bacteria, um, should be in a petri dish. You expose it to this antibiotic like doxycycline, and it dies within 3 or 4 weeks, which is the replication cycle for the bacteria. Now, in the body, which is a complex system, things don't really behave the same way they do in a laboratory, which is an isolated system. In the body, these spirochetes might be able to hide out, might be able to form what's called biofilms where they bond together and get stronger. But moreover, what can happen is that your nervous system, which regulates your immune response, can actually learn to continue to overprotect your body. And this is where it gets to a point where this is even more recent research and understanding that's coming about into the neurological component of these chronic conditions, things like Lyme disease or even long COVID to some extent. There is a neurological learning component whereby essentially, imagine if you're sick for a long period of time, your brain can learn that it needs to stay engaged. It needs to keep the immune system active. And for an acute infection, for a short infection, that's fine. We want the immune system to be able to, ramp up its inflammatory mechanisms and kick the infection out. But if the infection stays, even if it stays dormant, now all of a sudden the brain keeps that immune response going. And what you feel is whenever you experience flu-like symptoms, you might have heard of this term, the cytokine storm. What you're feeling is actually not the flu itself. What you're feeling is your immune system's reaction to it. So now imagine you're in a case where your immune system is getting the signal from the brain that it needs to continuously overreact to this, because the condition doesn't seem to relent. So that kind of leads to this vicious cycle scenario where you know the the adrenals are getting tired, the immune system is getting tired, but the brain is saying, "Hey, we're still at war here. You got to keep going." And meanwhile, the whole system is just getting exhausted and depleted.
Yeah. So this is the overact reactivity point that you just mentioned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I think one thing that stands out to me in hearing this is almost like I have a new way of thinking about this criticism of somebody saying it's all in your head. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like how we automatically construe that as being it's a pejorative attack. It's like you're making it up. This is fiction. This is not reality. But actually, you're distilling it in that way of going, no, actually, part of what's in our head is our brain, and that has so much power and influence over who we are, what we do, how we operate in the world, and of course, all the illness side that you're describing here too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, where I would like to to get things and help people get to is a place where they can have that nuanced conversation about it being in our head and in our body. I think the what becomes triggering is that, and understandably so, most of the time, or more often than not, the person who's saying it's all in your head is stuck in this old linear paradigm of disease where it's either in your head or it's in your body, but not both. When in reality, the brain is in constant communication with the body. Not only that, but through various feedback loops, the brain is essentially regulating every cell, organ, and system in the body. And the body is feeding information back to the brain, telling it, yes, keep doing this, or no, let's do something else.
Mm.
So I agree with you. I think that we should our goal should be to get to that place where we can say, yes, it's in your head and it's in your body. And this is how the whole system is interconnected.
Yeah, I love that. But I'm really eager to hear your own healing journey and what happened for you after these 3 years of being bedridden to be in the point now where you're CEO of a company helping people articulating yourself so beautifully, which I imagine was not as easy for you at that period of time in your life.
Yeah.
Tell us about this time and your healing.
Yep. So going back to that time where we left off, I had, one doctor led to many others. You don't really get a clear answer, or maybe you get an answer like Lyme disease, but it's sort of enshrouded in all of these other answers that equally make no sense. So I just kind of continued down that road, went to 20, 25, maybe 30 different doctors. One general practitioner sends you to a specialist, a cardiologist who says, "Oh my God, your heart is totally dysregulated. You got to go see the neurologist." The neurologist says, oh my God, your electrical conductivity is all out of whack. We got to do MRIs. And it sort of began this cycle where for years, my life was just being in bed or going to a doctor, every several weeks, having another basically sort of panicking experience, having another battery of tests done, only to find that those tests are, coming up short, don't really tell you anything interesting, or most importantly, don't really tell you what to do. So this is the bittersweet challenge of someone who's going through a chronic condition, is that even if you get a diagnosis, um, there's this moment of excitement, or this moment of reprieve where it's like, oh, thank God they know what this is. But what follows that moment is the realization that they have no idea what to do with this or what to do with you, right? So they say chronic fatigue syndrome, that really just means tired all the time. It's like, I could have told you that. Fibromyalgia means muscle pain, right? There was a friend of mine jokingly said, but with some hint of truth, he said, oh, I went to the doctor with pain in my knee and I got diagnosed with knee pain. So that was a little bit tongue in cheek, but pretty much that's that's how these things go, and that was the case for me. So on and on. Um, Lyme disease was a recurring theme, and at the time, also the greater sort of Lyme political environment was such that more people were these so-called Lyme literate doctors starting to pop up, and there was more recognition of it, which is a really positive thing. Um, but I went down that road of taking a lot of antibiotics, and um, for me, it really didn't seem to do the trick. It got me a little bit deeper into a vicious cycle where antibiotics, we know, have a deleterious impact on your gut health, which of course has a huge impact on your immune system. So I found that when I took antibiotics, and I started with regular oral antibiotics and worked my way up to intravenous antibiotics, and uh, so on and so forth, there was a time when it would alleviate or lessen the symptoms a little bit, because antibiotics, we now know, have an anti-inflammatory property as well. But it didn't really seem to solve the long-term problem. And there was one doctor who said something to me that really stuck with me. He said that ultimately, no medicine, whether pharmaceutical or supplement, will ever be as powerful as your body's own immune system, right? And the reason that was so powerful for me to hear him say that was because, one, it meant that you are intact in a way. You everything that you need, or your immune system, this thing that you already have within you, is capable of doing this job. In fact, it's capable of doing it so well that nothing else that we've been able to synthesize in a lab over the last several decades even comes close to what your own immune system can do. So that was very empowering. And then, of course, the question arises, well, okay, then how do I do that, right? How do I optimize my immune system so that it can do its thing? And therein kind of led to a whole new way of thinking, a whole new paradigm that was less about trying to regulate my condition or control my circumstances from the outside in, and much more about trying to reestablish, in what I was now understanding to be an innate capacity that every human being has, which is this sort of capacity to balance and self-heal. We know this as homeostasis. So this is basically what that word means, to arrive at a point of self-management.
Right. And then for yourself, you then embarked on this journey of what, ditching the antibiotics and finding an alternative route, or what was instrumental in you healing? Because as I learned before speaking with you, you now don't have Lyme's disease, right? Or
Yeah.
the other conditions that you were describing.
Yeah, yeah. So I went more toward this is where podcasts came in handy, because at the time I was still so brain fogged. Again, this was about 10 years ago. So podcasts were just starting to be a thing. UC Berkeley was putting their 1 and 200 level classes out for free as podcasts. And I would say that, at the time, because of the brain fog, I couldn't read. I couldn't spend much time on the internet or anything like that, which I think was a good thing. But if I had one thing that was kind of going for me at the time, it was curiosity. It was, okay, let's take these little bits of information, really latch on to bits of information that were the hopeful bits, like this concept that the body is a self-healing system, that your immune system is very powerful. I would really latch onto those concepts because the alternative is to latch onto all of the fear concepts, and that
Yes.
doesn't move us forward. It moves us kind of in a bit of a spiral,
Yeah, and a
um,
downwards one.
a downward one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because there wasn't much that I could do at the time, I used those hopeful sound bites as arrows, as indicators of where to go. And that led me to ask that doctor, well, okay, where does that concept come from? And he turns out he was a practitioner of biological medicine. So I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. What's that? Let's go down that road. Listen to some podcasts, take some courses on, biological medicine, um, and started to get deeper into, at this point, the body and the body's ability to self regulate and balance itself. And so I did all of the what I now see as kind of the low hanging fruit, which is really some lifestyle things, removing things that were triggering sensitivities like foods, um, trying to reduce levels of inflammation and toxicity by taking up some relaxation practices, drinking a lot of fresh water with lemon juice, getting rid of things that were acidic in the diet. So these are sort of bottom up approaches that could just support the body to come into a better state of rest and use its resources a little bit better. And so doing those kinds of things, helped me kind of get to the next level. I felt a little bit more energy come back. But then I was in a place where I found that I was still very easily triggered. It was like if I came up against one sensitivity, which for me at the time, loud sounds, bright lights, almost every food except for sweet potatoes was, would trigger sensitivity type reaction. Negative thoughts, worries, all of these things acted as triggers that would pretty much almost immediately exacerbate those flu-like symptoms. And so I found that, okay, there's something else going on because even now that I'm taking care of my body so diligently, I'm doing all this lifestyle stuff, doing all this. I was even starting to do a lot of meditation and breathing, and it helped. It really helped calm my system down. I realized that my system didn't stay calm. It was so trigger happy. It just wanted to jump back into high alert where it was before. And so this is where I kind of started to walk up the chain from the body to the brain and started to read books like Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. I had also, I should say, one of the diagnoses I received was MS, multiple sclerosis. This was ended up not being, I think, the most accurate diagnosis, but it was there because I had brain scans and they saw brain lesions in the neocortex, and so my brain effectively looked like an MS patient or an Alzheimer's patient, and that was one of the most scary things because I didn't know much about the brain, but I knew that if it's something when you put these words together, damage and brain, it
Yes.
didn't, it doesn't sit well. um,
No.
so,
Fear. So it's remarkable that you held on to your positivity and curiosity, really.
well, it was sort of monkey barring from one one thing to the next, and um, when I got up that chain up to the point where I was starting to, look at things like Norman Doidge, The Brain That Changes Itself, where he started talking about this concept of neuroplasticity, that's where I really started to get hopeful. And I remembered back to my early days as before I got sick. I was a personal trainer and athlete. And I remember I had just fallen in love early on in life with this concept of being able to affect change in your own body and your own system. I loved that idea that you could have an idea in your mind about getting stronger, and then you could learn to do something like a series of exercises or a protocol that would actually lead to the realization of that thing that was merely an idea in your head. Um, and as I started to learn about neuroplasticity, that was a huge awakening because and excitement too, because I realized, okay, this is kind of like that. I'm not in the same place of like health, but basically what this literature is saying is that your brain, just like your muscles, just like your cardiovascular system, your brain is really malleable. It's constantly changing where it was previously thought to be static and that we would only lose brain cells as we grow through life. the last few decades of research have shown that there's something called neurogenesis that takes place, which is the generation of new neurons, new brain cells throughout our entire lives. And not only that, there's also something called functional neuroplasticity, which says that the brain is actually capable of changing its structure and its function. And so there's a lot of research that backs this up as well. But the more I learned about it, it felt like it reminded me of when I was a teenager learning about things like bodybuilding and stuff for the first time. Like, that it was exciting that I could actually do something here that might have some positive impact.
A question I have actually is, were you considered then by doctors to be a case of spontaneous remission or spontaneous healing because you
Yeah.
didn't follow the medical path?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up because, yeah, there was really two doctors. These are, MDs, medical doctors that had seen me at various points throughout my illness. And then um, one of the first things they said when I got better, and one of them I just ran into on the street by happenstance. The other I revisited later on for further testing. Um, but yes, they actually did bring up the word spontaneous remission or spontaneous recovery. And at the time, it kind of made me chuckle because I knew that it was anything but spontaneous. That's not to say,
Such a good
yeah,
point. Right. No,
yeah,
go on. That's good. Explain that.
yeah. It's not to say that I had the entire path and protocol and map and everything mapped out in my mind beforehand, but it's sort of like I saw this quote the other day. I thought it was kind of funny. It said, "I don't know where I'm going, but I know how to get there." And and the idea is that if you show up and do a certain, like, a series of things every day, you might not know exactly where you're going or how exactly it's going to get you there, but something will happen, something will change. And if you, just the same way that if you get up and go to the gym every day, whereas previously you didn't do that, you don't know exactly where you're going to be, how you're going to change, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, but you can be sure that you will change dramatically. And the same is true here for your brain when it comes to retraining the brain, which really means to retrain your body's innate responses, to retrain the way your body responds to stress, to retrain the way your immune system reacts, to retrain your inflammatory processes. Um, when you do this consistently over time, you are basically rebuilding yourself. The other bit of information that I latched onto, one of those hope things, is this article I had read in, I think it was Popular Science, although this information has been shared in many places, where they were talking about every cell in the body turning over at various rates and replicating and renewing itself. So I'm sure some listeners will be familiar with the idea, at least, that after 7 years, not a single cell in your body is the same.
Yeah. Is that a myth? I have heard that, but I didn't know if it
It,
was true or not.
It's true. It's true.
It is true.
And it
Okay.
happens over different phases. So, for instance, the lining of the stomach replaces itself, say, every 30 days. Skeletal and connective tissue every 18 months. Brain tissue every 6 months. So there's these different time frames over which the cells of these different, parts that make up you literally are dying, replicating, and growing new cells. And it's true that to the point that after a certain period of time, every single cell in your body will be different. And so the reason that was so hopeful for me is because I was like, okay, let's say right now it seems like I have a lot of sick cells going on in my body. My brain lesions. I had arthritis that had manifested in connective tissue damage. So there was a lot of stuff, and a lot of these types of things. Mainstream medicine, um, the mentality is that they don't repair. You'll commonly hear things like if you have a meniscus tear in your knee or something, well, the meniscus doesn't really have a blood supply, so it's not going to be able to heal, which might be true that it doesn't have its own blood supply, but it doesn't mean that it's not in a constant state of communication and engagement with the rest of your body as a collective system. So the question for me became, okay, I like this idea of like everything is changing. By 7 years from now, I could theoretically be a completely different person. Is there something that I can do to influence the direction of this change? Right? Because if my cells are always changing, it could be the case that maybe they just keep changing into the same state that they're in now. But could I augment them in such a way or give them a new message that's going to tell them to change into a better state than they're in now? And what would that look like over 7 years? And
Tell us
sure
about
enough,
that. What did that end up being for you, because well, actually, I first want to go back to this point about the spontaneous healing. It came to mind because one of the previous guests on the podcast was a Harvard medical professor, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, and he wrote a book on spontaneous healing. He called it was Cured: The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing. And he says that doctors like him were taught in medical school that so-called miraculous recoveries are flukes. And because they are flukes, they have there's no real reason why we should study them. And even if there is a substantial minority, let's say, of people who do experience this, it wasn't deemed worthy of medical attention. And he found that frustrating on some level and ended up dedicating the next 15 years to doing a lot of research into this domain. And it's funny you mentioned this point about it's really not spontaneous at all, because he ended up discovering through that research, he identified 4 key pillars, I think. And you have mentioned all of them actually. So he
yeah,
said the 4 key pillars, according to this doctor, that we need to heal our immune system, heal our nutrition, heal our stress response, and heal our identity. And I also heard you mention right back at the start of this podcast something about your beliefs and how significant that was for you. Can you walk us through that time for you? Like, what had to change in your mind, aside from your body, but like your your mindset essentially, negativity versus positivity, curiosity versus fear-based responses. What did that look like for you, and could you feel the impact of and see the impact of the changes that you were making on this journey?
yeah, yeah. So one of the most challenging things about healing and recovery or going through any form of change is that change takes time. And there's a lag between when you do something and when you see a result. And what's even a little bit more challenging is that, counter to how we most of the time experience or expect to experience things in life, I believe that the catalyst is actually the belief, is the curiosity. It's the ability to reframe your situation and yourself and get into a certain mindset that can be a little bit more beneficial uh, to your body and to your brain than the one you're in now. And I say it's challenging because normally, what we would expect to happen is, oh, I do something, I get a result, and when I get better or get a positive result, now I'm a believer, right? It's like the last thing. And
Yes.
here we're saying actually one of those pillars and that you mentioned, and one of the most important things is actually, I think it's almost the first domino. It's the mindset. It's being able to see yourself in a bigger context and in a way take a leap of faith. A leap of faith to me isn't blind faith. It's not wishful thinking. It's actually taking a step back and realizing that where you are is true, but it's also temporary, that everything is changing, nothing is static. And when you see yourself in this bigger picture, it becomes possible to do the impossible. Basically, it becomes possible to simultaneously accept where you are while at the same time look toward the future with a mindset of hope. And anything that you can use to do that, like for me, that understanding of the cells replacing themselves, or the understanding of that came from that doctor of the immune system being incredibly powerful, or anything like that you can do, that's sufficient to allow you to open up that perspective and just start taking steps. Now you're free to move. You're free to create some wiggle room. You're free to practice being in a different way than you were before. And that is what starts to catalyze change.
Mm. If you were to look back on this period of time in your life now, with the period of time where you were going through these significant health problems, what would you say the key lessons were for you, the ones that strike you, that stand out, that are memorable and remain with you today.
Ooh, I can think of one that's coming up real prominently because, in life, challenges don't end when you
No.
overcome the obstacle, right? There's always another mountain to climb. Um, the number one that's with me right now is give yourself permission to start over every day. Even break it down further, every moment if you have to. And when you start to frame it in this way, I think something pretty cool happens. We start to view starting over not as like this big fearful thing, but almost as an experiment, as something liberating. It frees us to try something differently. And here's the cool part. There is literally no limit to the number of times that we can fall down or fall off and then get back up. We can do this 100 times a day. It doesn't matter. In fact, I would argue that the more times we do start over, it's like doing another repetition of an exercise and we get better at it and it becomes more fun.
Mm. So you felt like for you, you had that mindset of, I'm just going to keep trying. Because I'm also hearing here about trying something new. Yes. Embracing a new beginning. Yes. But also persevere. Don't give up.
Yeah, the journey is the destination, so to speak, or the destination is the journey itself, because otherwise we could just we could get so frustrated, right? We take steps and sometimes we get good results and sometimes we get no results. And that is the healing journey in a nutshell is it's very nonlinear. There are ups and downs. And because there are such delayed responses and we're dealing with such a complex system as the human being, um, it it isn't the case that like you do something and it works the same every time. Sometimes you do something, you eat that way, and then it stops working. And sometimes you do what you did before, and it has the opposite effect. Um, what matters is that we just keep putting one foot in front of the other and just keep going.
Mm.
And when we do this, that's when it really starts to transform that what was previously this really frightening concept of letting go of the old way and starting a new one. It can even turn into sort of, kind of a game.
Fun. That's a nice new approach. And something else you also said, which struck me, was you said paradoxically, you learnt that when you actually stopped resisting challenges, your brain and your body became much better equipped to deal with them more effectively.
Yes. So when we are stuck in that state, that fight or flight state, especially and understandably so when we've been going through a condition or any sort of hard, challenging experience, the brain always wants to learn from the past in order to protect you in the future. So it's going to learn to overly protect, to be sort of trigger happy and clamp down. Um, and this leads to a lot of internal resistance. Everything feels like a trigger. Imagine if you're, let's just take an emotional, state for example that everyone can relate to, anger or frustration, right? Imagine like you're already frustrated and now you find that you're in traffic and now you find that your boss calls and that like all these things that happen which really are clean experiences. That's to say like they're just things that happen. But if you're in a state of agitation, you're in a state of frustration, you're going to find these things to be very triggering and it's going to increase that state of agitation. It's going to make your brain looking for more triggers and respond even more virulently to those. And so it creates this sort of cycle. And our rational mind tells us that the way to solve this problem is to solve the problem. It's to, look for answers, right? It's to make the traffic go away. It's
Go
to find a
away.
better
Yeah.
route. Yeah. It's all these kinds of things when in reality, it's actually to stop pushing against it. One of the quotes I love from Einstein, I pulled it into the Reorigin program, is that it's not about finding the solution, but undoing the basis of the problem. So
Can you break
how
that
do we?
down?
Yeah, he says it's not about finding the solution, but undoing the basis of the problem. So let's try this for
And the basis of the problem is the mindset or
let's
the
try this.
state of agitation? Okay, go on.
Yeah,
I'm
let's try this
listening.
experiment for a moment. Everyone, anyone listening can try this. provided you're not driving, you take your right hand, right?
Mhm.
And take your left hand. Now push your right hand into your left hand. Now, what's happening with your left hand? Probably find that it's pushing back, right?
Yeah.
And so, an example of us trying to get out of this scenario by solving the problem would be pushing harder, right? We just keep pushing harder, pushing harder. But the harder you push against something, the harder it pushes back. And so, we're actually just intensifying the problem. Now, what would it mean to undo the basis of the problem? Well, we let go, we shake it out, or we divert our attention elsewhere.
Yes. Letting go. It's something I speak about a lot and something that we all struggle with so much, I've got to say. But do you have any tips on that front? Is there anything that's kind of struck you as, oh, this has helped me let go? And not only of the fact that I'm sitting in traffic right now, but the fact that I'm in bed and I can't do anything about this right now, or any other number of things that could actually be seriously significant that most people get caught of like, how can I let go of this? Like this is shit. Like what what?
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that really changed this for me is that uh, starting to learn that letting go is not an intellectual thing that you do. Um, Kind of for the same reason that you can't think your way out of anxiety. Um, it actually can be done in a much more vivid way with the body. So and the other thing is that letting go actually is something that you can practice. It's something that you can practice with repetition. And it's something that when you do practice it repetitively, it gets easier and it gets even programmed in as a default setting. So one way that I like to help people learn to like let go or let go of a resistance is to first and foremost is really kind of we can break it down to three steps. Okay. So the first step is simply becoming aware of whatever you might be resisting. Maybe it's a strong emotion. Maybe it's an uncomfortable physical sensation or thought. Maybe it's a situation that you feel like you're having some adverse reaction to. Whatever it might be, just become aware that there is something that you are resisting right there. All right. So the second thing is to interrupt that resistance. For me, and this became the title of my TED Talk, it was taking one deep breath, right? So the moment you become aware that you're resisting something, how can you do something differently? Most of the time, this helps to do something with your body that leads you to this feeling of exhalation.
Mm.
Taking a deep breath and having a slow exhale is a great way to do that. There's some other somatic techniques that involve, you can shake it out. You can even put a smile on your face and change your posture, your physiology. Amy Cuddy gave a great TED talk on
Yes.
power poses, right? So there's a
Yeah.
number of
I tried
dials
that
that we
one
can
out at a
play.
job interview and it totally worked in my favor. I went and shut
Yeah,
myself in the cubicle and Amy Cuddy said, like, go and put your arms in the air like you're crossing the finish line, winning the race. And I was like, yeah. And it's true, it really shifted something. I'm also a fan of a sigh, which I didn't realize I did that. My best friend sent me a meme about the people who do these one random loud sigh in front of everyone. Didn't realize I did it, but turns out there's apparently some scientific evidence that that helps us to
yeah,
de-stress a little bit of just going, like that reaction we so many of us have when we're in a stressful moment or we're frustrated, right? And we don't realize like, oh, that's your body's way of helping you to de-stress right now.
it's true. And there you'll notice a lot of these things when you start to tune into your body's natural inclinations. Sometimes you'll tap your foot or you'll touch your forehead. These are all things that are actually there are certain points in the forehead, um, and shaking, tapping, sighing. All of these basically activate the vagus nerve, which is the parasympathetic rebound. So this branch of the nervous system that helps you, like you name it, like a parachute, parasympathetic, like come down for a safe landing.
Oh, I like that way. The parasympathetic parachute. I've never thought of it that way, and I always mess them up, sympathetic
Yeah,
and parasympathetic. So thanks. I'll remember that one.
yeah, sure. So yeah, like a lot of times, like our body has wisdom. It's almost doing these things naturally, but when you do them with intention, then it becomes a tool. It becomes something that you can use, um, as you need it. So yeah, those just to go back, those basic kind of 3 steps are like identify when you're resisting something, interrupt it with any one of these tools, a physiologic sigh, a deep breath, a smile on your face. And then the last step is ultimately to replace it with a different state, a different image, a different cue that gives your body a different feeling. And so if you had an image of a conversation with your angry boss or something, maybe now you divert to a, after your pause and interruption, to an image of something that doesn't even necessarily have to be the same kind of scenario. It can just be anything that gives you a calm feeling, right? An image of nature, an image of being at peace, being not in conflict, the opposite of whatever that triggering experience was.
And that all helps to activate what you're saying is our sympathetic nervous system that helps us to calm down, to de-stress, to become less reactive.
Yep, all the above.
Let's go into some specific ways of retraining our brain. And I know important themes that you speak about regularly are that of what we're just suggesting there with becoming more calm and also having a state of less reactivity so that we can enjoy ourselves more, quite frankly, and have more power and freedom over our choices and how we decide to show up moment to moment. Walk us through what retraining your brain looks like, what you do, even is part of your business.
Yeah, sure. So, uh, yeah, the business, the company that I have is called Reorigin, and it's effectively a brain retraining program for people with anxiety, depression, and chronic inflammatory conditions. So this is like Lyme disease, like I experienced. We have a lot of people now who are recovering from long COVID and other forms of so-called post-infectious syndrome, which basically means that the brain and body are stuck in a highly reactive state even beyond the acute phase of the illness. And so, yeah, at this point, we have people coming to us from really all over the world with a wide range of these different conditions. But the common thread for all of them is this feeling of hyperactivity in the brain. Usually, while at the same time, the body is exhausted, right? So people say, I feel tired and wired, or I feel exhausted, but my mind just won't let me rest, or I feel overwhelmed and like I'm moving through jello, like I felt. A lot of sleep issues as well. We recently surveyed the community, and about 90% of the people had pretty severe insomnia, and we ended up just doing a workshop on how to retrain your brain for better sleep. So the kind of through line, what we're seeing is as more research comes out to support this, is something known as limbic kindling or limbic system dysfunction. So basically, the limbic system is the part of the brain that's responsible for threat detection and response, meaning it takes information from the environment, all of the information that's coming in through our senses, and it makes a decision. It basically has to decide: is this information, is this experience dangerous, like threatening or non-threatening? And when the limbic system gets really ramped up, when we have that sort of wired in the brain feeling, because the brain's first order of business is survival, it will err on the side of caution and fire off that limbic response as a protective response. It will say, okay, that loud noise of the car honking the horn down the street, dangerous, threat, right? And it will register it as a threat, and then it will mount what would be an appropriate response, the threat response, which includes sympathetic activation, inflammation, all of these things. But we know now that it's actually not appropriate, in the sense that that honking horn, unpleasant as it might be, is not actually life threatening. So
Hmm.
the brain starts to learn more and more when it's in these states that various things, various foods or light or sound or pathogens or symptoms themselves, sensations in the body, are threats, when in fact they are discomforts, right? Which is very different from being life threatening.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. So then would somebody know that their parasympathetic nervous system is activated if they're suddenly more jumpy? Like even just a simple example, like how you mentioned the door closing, for example. Is there a link there with somebody being more reactive to something quickly and then being
Yeah,
more tense?
Yeah, so there's a few different indications, and we actually have some quizzes on our website that can help people identify if they're what they're experiencing is this sort of limbic dysfunction. And one of them is, yeah, increased sense of arousal, we call it, or alertness or jumpiness. Another one is increased difficulty coming back down to baseline, right? So now that something's taking you above baseline, how easy or hard of a time do you have getting back down there? And for people with limbic dysfunction or where the brain has been trained to be overly on it, they find that it's very hard to break that cycle and to come back into a state of relaxation.
So overall, what are some of the key elements that you teach in order for people to retrain their brain to operate in a different way and to achieve greater calm?
Yeah. Well, there's really a few what we call keys to recovery in the program. And the first one starts actually with awareness. So the first part of our program, which is basically like online video streaming program, and then seated within a community where we have group coaching and things like that. Um, the first part is educational. It's just helping people understand the role of the brain in these types of conditions, including anxiety and depression. Um, and that understanding alone is actually the first key to recovery. Because when we understand that there's a reason behind why I feel the way I feel, now all of a sudden the nervous system can relax a little bit. We can, because for so many people in these scenarios, like I was, um, one of the really unnerving things is going down these rabbit holes and finding that there's no apparent cause. It's very, distressing to learn that you're feeling horrible and on paper you look fine and the doctors
Yeah,
shrugging their shoulders and everything. So,
sure.
um, so understanding that there is a reason, for you for that explains why you're feeling the way you do. That alone can help people to calm down. But the secondary benefit is that when we actually use that part of our brain that's designed for things like comprehension, this is the neocortex, the sort of professor of the brain, activating that part of the brain when you're learning about, say, the brain body connection, actually deactivates or turns down activity in the limbic system. So it actually has, you could call it a therapeutic effect just by learning about the sort of mechanics of what's happening. So that's really step one, is awareness and understanding. Then the next step is we need some way to shift gears, right? And for this, we have a protocol that helps people do kind of what we said before, identify when they're in these, what we call them limbic loops, when they're in these hyperreactive states, and then reliably be able to shift out of that state. And I always say, like, it's amazing that there are things that we can do that can help us shift in real time, right? Like taking a deep breath or letting out a sigh, um, if you, or shifting into a power pose. Like, these things are really cool that they can really have an immediate physiologic impact on us. But I think what's even more cool, and what people want even more than that, is a way to solidify that change so that they don't have
Yes.
to necessarily always remember to do that shift, right? They want to create that as their new default response. And so for this, we go into that third key, which is consistent conditioning. And really, one of the most important things is that they practice these exercises throughout the day. We have a certain, protocol for how and when to practice, but to reliably make that shift over and over again until it becomes wired in as your new default response.
And how long does it take for that to happen typically?
Great question. And it definitely varies from person to person. Everyone,
Yeah.
is coming with a different amount of time in with condition and different conditions themselves. Even when people have the same quote unquote condition, each person, I would argue, has a unique expression of that. And so, for that reason, one of the things we do in the program is help people really personalize these protocols. Because while for you, the physiologic sigh might work, for someone else, maybe it's not quite as effective. They need to do a visualization, or they need to do, something different. So when we kind of find what's right for your nervous system, that lock and key fit, um, then it comes down to repetition and conditioning. And in terms of the time frame, typically, I describe it for people in three phases. There are three phases that you'll go through. Those three phases are what I call isolate, integrate, and improvise. So if you think of, let's apply this for a moment to learning an instrument, right? Let's say you're trying to learn, I don't know, the violin. The first phase of learning anything new, especially something like a complex movement pattern like playing an instrument, is to isolate each individual variable. So you have to learn the individual notes and practice the individual, fingering, and just practice, practice, practice until you can make those clean sounds on each note. Then, of course, we don't want to stop there. The idea is to integrate those individual notes into a scale and a melody so you can actually start to make music. So this next phase is more about taking what you've learned and integrating it into some functional, realm, piece of music in this case. As it pertains to the brain retraining, that first phase is just practicing in a dedicated manner, shifting, how to shift your nervous system, shifting into that parasympathetic state, and then practicing it when we go into that second phase of integration. Now we want to be able to integrate that ability to shift into your everyday life, into the moments when you need it, into the places where you're actually being triggered and challenged, right? I found that in my experience, I went into meditation, became, long-term meditator for 10 years. Even after a decade of meditation, I found that I would still get triggered really easily the moment I set foot outside the meditation studio. Um, and that's because I needed some way to bring that new response into the real world with me and practice in those scenarios as well. So that second phase of our program is really about integration. It's about bringing this ability to shift into the real world. And then the third and final phase, improvisation. This is where it gets to the point where it's unconscious for people. They no longer have to think about it. They're just sort of playing jazz. And in terms of time frame, what we find is that it can take anywhere from as little as 30 days per phase, to, in some cases, more, up to 60 or 90 days per phase. Um, but even that, we're seeing, even if you think of like on the longer end of the spectrum, where it would be, 90 days per phase, the fact that at the end of a year or so, you could be in this place where you're stepping into an environment that previously was very triggering to you. And now you're able to stay calm and not even think about that old response. Um, that seems like a pretty empowering thing.
So, in terms of let's just break this down in practical terms, or something that somebody could take away just from this conversation now, aside from the theoretical element of like, what is something that I could do to start on this journey of changing something about myself? And does it need to be so specific as, um I want to change my mindset? I'm always in negativity, for example. I'm always in negativity and complaint, and I recognize I have that pattern. It sucks and I want to stop. Would something like that follow the three stages that you just mentioned now?
Sure, absolutely. So essentially, remember, there's a starting point, there's an ending point, and then there's something that happens to shift in the middle. And so effectively, let's take this example of like you realize that you'd probably benefit from, better mood, feeling lighter perhaps. Um, so what again starts with the first step, which is identification. So you would merely, write down the things that you find are triggering you, right? Um, the next step is you do that pattern interrupt. So in our program, this is we have a 5-step protocol for this. There's a fair bit of nuance, to it. For this reason, we have about 7 hours of video program to get through. But effectively, we are pausing that initial response that we have. So if you find that, oh, your mind is going down these loops of those old negative thoughts, we pause it by changing our posture, by acknowledging that this is just a brain pattern. It's not me. So this is a process known as disidentification, where we basically create a little bit of distance between the the scenario and our identity. We don't overly identify with it. So we kind of step into that observer role, right?
Yeah.
And then we've done what Viktor Frankl calls gotten in the space between stimulus and response. And now that we've created this space, now we're free to replace our old response, which might have been spiraling down a thought loop, with a new response, which might be, you know what, I want to choose to think about something that gives me a better feeling. Maybe at first it's hard to just think about something in the abstract, but what else can I do that gives me a better feeling? Well, maybe putting on music, maybe going for a walk, maybe getting into my body, doing something, with my breath. So this is where the individuality and personalization comes into play. But once you kind of have, so on one side, you have your list of triggers and loops that are bringing you down. On the other side, you have your list of positive things and this toolkit of things that can help bring you up and create an upward spiral, going for a walk, taking a deep breath, sighing, listening to music, looking at a picture, looking at a travel magazine, making travel plans, whatever it might be. Now you have this sort of arsenal, or it might not be the right word, but this huge toolkit of things that can trigger and elicit positive feelings in you. The only thing that remains to be done is practice making that switch. And now something really, really cool happens, because when you start to engage with a process like this, not only do you stop seeing those old negative thought spirals and loops as being so intimidating, but actually those previously seen as obstacles now become opportunities to practice the new response. So it can actually become like this exciting thing, like, oh, there's that negative thought, or there's that old, triggering thing. Oh, this is another chance for me to practice using my new toolkit. And
What
the
a
more you practice,
beautiful
the easier it
reframe.
becomes.
That's
Yeah.
it. That's it. Obstacles as opportunities to craft a new way. And I mean, I hear so much this undercurrent of positivity in you, and really hope, and also confidence in people's ability to change. Like, hey guys, this is possible. Like, there is a program, there are steps, you follow this is how your brain works, and you can make the change that you want. And I can say, even for me, I'm experiencing that as being so reassuring on some level, because I think so many of us, we get caught in negativity. We can easily fall into a sense of helplessness, or a tide, like, okay, I've tried this and this and this, and it's just not working, and I just seem to keep continuing in these same spirals, or these same circles, and never moving forward. And I just hear from you, actually, obviously with your personal story as well, what a transformation you have made in your life. you know what I want to finish on this before we go to our final fast few questions. But what has really substantially changed in your life as you have embarked on this journey of healing?
Yeah. I think the biggest change is a feeling of lightness. You know, I
Mm,
used to feel, prior to getting ill, that I was carrying a really heavy load. I had even sort of became a realization years after I initially got sick and learned about Lyme and all these different conditions, that I think it was really the understanding that um, people respond differently to different things, and that our responses um, are not isolated incidences. They're part of a cumulative impact, that makes us who and what we are. And so, to me, the big realization was that the Lyme, to say, the bacteria, the infection, was like the straw that broke the camel's back. But the camel's back probably wouldn't have broken if it wasn't already carrying this heavy load, right? I think a lot of people can probably relate to that, where
I relate to that.
yeah. And it's not to say that the thing itself, the trauma, the injury, the illness, um, isn't an insult. It is, but it's like adding the insult to the already injured scenario. And I think in so many of our cases, I also helps to normalize this and realize that you're not unique if you feel that way. You're not alone. So many people can relate to that. So many people feel that there is this pressure that has built up, because it has. And we know now, even from science and research, that the nervous system has this thing, what's known as the allostatic load, which is this total cumulative load that can build up stress and tension and pressure in the system, that can mount itself in our body tissue even. Um, and unless it's looking for release. It's looking for ways to come out. And sometimes it will take any opportunity to do that. And more often than not, I think for a lot of us, that quote unquote opportunity, for the pressure to be released comes in the form of an illness or an injury or a trauma of some sort. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think for me, being able to look back now and realize that whole experience of going through Lyme actually was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it not only uncorked the pressure valve and over time allowed all this stuff to come back and to reset, it also gave me the tools and the knowledge to never let that happen again. That I call resilience. So I think we can come back with this sense of resilience, capability, and uh, just feeling like we're really in tune with ourselves. And when you feel that way, you feel really light, because even if a heavy thing comes along, it doesn't mean that I'm never going to bear a heavy load. We face challenges every day, but it means that we're equipped to deal with it. And so then again, we start to see those challenges, those obstacles as opportunities to just get stronger.
Ben, you know what? I want to finish there because that was just such a beautiful, inspiring final few words to end with. Honestly, like you really are the story that you share, the way you articulate yourself. I'm sure everyone listening can really hear that through Ben and what he shares. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and being that
Thank
source
you.
of inspiration, guidance, and a wealth of knowledge too.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like I'm a man on the road. The journey is never complete, but we can always take more steps.
That's it. The destination is the journey. What was it?
That's it.
The yeah,
One of those. I can't
was
think of which way it goes, but we'll go with that one. The
we'll go
destination is
with
the
that one.
journey. Sounds good.